Thanks for joining us. My presentation today will be on agroforestry and its role in mitigating and adapting to climate change. My name is Gary Bentrup. I'm a research landscape planner with the USDA National Agroforestry Center here in Lincoln, Nebraska. The presentation today, we're going to kind of talk about how climate change is impacting agriculture and food systems, and then go into how agroforestry can help in creating climate resilient agriculture. And then we'll wrap it up with a few little mini case studies to kind of bring it on home. I first want to acknowledge that agroforestry has a long history in indigenous communities. It is not anything new. And along that, I want to create a land acknowledgement. Here in Lincoln, Nebraska, we're sitting on lands of the Pawnee, Sioux, and Oto. And I want this to not necessarily be an endpoint in terms of our improving relations with Indigenous, but merely a starting point for improving our efforts. And with the USDA, we strive very hard to improve our efforts with Indigenous communities. So just a little bit on myself. I'm a landscape architect by background and training. I'm a research landscape planner at the USDA National Agroforestry Center. And I grew up on a farm in western Kansas, and it was a farm my grandfather started. You can see a picture in the upper corner there. And I think I was destined to work in agroforestry as I tried to, or was exploring the growing of botanicals in our family's shelter belt around the farmstead, and was looking at actually growing ginseng and other medicinal herbs as an economic opportunity. I ended up not pursuing that, but lo and behold, I did end up in agroforestry. So to start off with climate change, the research or science behind climate change actually dates back to the 1800s. We've known for a long time that burning fossil fuels was going to impact our climate. And it was even noted in this 1911 Popular Mechanics article. And so here we are today with living with the impacts of climate change. And its impacts are going to vary across the region, across the country in regions, and will vary in terms of its intensity, in terms of what effects it will have on temperature, precipitation, length of growing season, whether there's hot spells or cold days and freeze days. And I put this up there not so much to focus on the details of this, but to recognize this regionality that will be inherent in climate change. To drill in a little deeper, here is just looking at heavy precipitation, and this is not future climate. This is actually reflecting basically the last 60 years of change in heavy precipitation events. And we can see there's been a significant uptick in heavy precipitation. And when we look forward with climate models, we can also see that this change in extreme precipitation events is only going to continue to increase. And this will have a significant impact, particularly in agriculture. But that said, we also have the opposite effect of droughts. And again, this is past observed measurements of looking at percentage of weeks in drought over the last 20 years about. And we can see there's been quite a bit of drought, particularly out west. And currently right now, we're in a very dry period here in the Great Plains and in Nebraska. And maybe to look at it in a more personal level, we are all familiar what the weather is like in the Lincoln and Omaha area. And if we look forward to, say, 2080, what the future climate will be like here in this area, it will be more representative of a climate in Enid, Oklahoma, which is about 7.5 degrees warmer in the summer and about 14% drier. So those are going to be some significant meteorological kind of changes. And we can often think of climate change as having an effect on, you know, crop production, livestock well-being, but there's a lot of indirect effects that climate change will have on ecosystem services. And I highlight one of our last previous droughts in 2012, which many of you may remember, was extremely dry. And then in 2013, we had an extremely wet spring. And the result was all the fertilizer that had been put on that previous year wasn't really utilized by crops because there just wasn't much production. And it ran off, creating a significant impact in the Gulf hypoxia zone, which is this dead zone of low oxygen in the Gulf. And it basically leads to no aquatic life in this area and greatly impacts the shrimping industry and other fisheries. And when we look at the input sources for the nitrogen and phosphorus that contribute to this Gulf hypoxia zone, the bulk of it is coming from agricultural sources, over 70%. And, you know, this has a tremendous economic effect. And just looking at Iowa, who has pledged to try to reduce their nitrogen and phosphorus loading, estimate that it's going to be around 1 to 3 billion per year for 50 years to meet this goal. And so this has significant ramifications in terms of how climate affects things that we don't often think it will affect. And then we look at the changes in indemnified losses due to extreme weather events. And we've seen a significant uptick over the years in terms of outlays to pay for these damages in crops, particularly, again, with drought and excessive moisture issues. But hail, heat, freeze, wind are all some of the factors that we have seen increase over time. And this has an impact on agriculture economics, you know, and the viability of individual farms and farm communities. We can see that there's been a general trend of net return from our agriculture areas declining over the years. This has kind of resulted in that many farms are have to have off-farm income in order to make it. And we can see from this chart, but for a majority of farms, there are off-farm income sources make up a significant portion of the overall income of farm operations. So this gets even down to the individual. We historically have spent around 20, you know, at around the turn of the century, 24%, a quarter of our disposable income on food. And now we're down around 9 to 10%. And our society is built around basically fairly inexpensive food. And yet it's having ramifications because of these externalities that you know, can cause some significant shocks in our economic system. And there's a lot more factors than just climate change at play here, but it's the sense that it has ripple effects through a lot of our systems in the agriculture arena. So quickly, what are some of the reasons why climate change is particularly hammering agricultural areas, maybe more than historically? And one factor is low crop and landscape diversity. We can see from this chart from the 40s and 70s and now to looking at what a typical Great Plains landscape looks like, of monocultures that are very susceptible to climatic effects as well as indirect climatic factors. Pest outbreaks can run rampant in systems that are very low diversity. And another factor is lack of vegetative cover, particularly perennial cover. You know, a good portion of our ground is uncovered in a given year in a monoculture annual system. And when we now look at climate change overlaid on that, we can see that precipitation increases are timed to incur more during our winter and spring when there is not this cover on the ground. And so this can cause significant erosion problems as well as other impacts. So when we start to step back and figure out how do we create climate smart solutions, there's criteria we can use to evaluate what our solutions should be. They should be multifunctional. We really need to think about the social and economic equitability and viability. These systems need to be more diversified and ideally no or limited externalities like Gulf hypoxia, where it creates impacts on a region and industry beyond its gates. So, this class is on agroforestry, and so we've covered agroforestry practices, and so no need to go into that in depth. And we've probably already seen that we kind of have some estimates of how many farms in the United States are practicing agroforestry. And so it is one tool that we can use to help mitigate and adapt to climate change. And so when we look at adaptation and mitigation, adaptation is reducing the threats to these extreme weather events as well as long-term weather events, and enhance the resiliency not only to direct climate effects, but some of the indirect effects that I mentioned, such as pest outbreaks. And then on another way, it can also facilitate species movement, both plant and animal species. From a mitigation side, agroforestry can sequester carbon and reduce other greenhouse gas emissions. So the IPCC has rated agroforestry as one of the top land management options for addressing climate change, both as a mitigation and adaptation strategy. And then we don't often think of desertification here in the United States, but it is a real concern in other parts of the United States. And so that's an important factor as well as having a positive effect on food security and land restoration. So when we look more specifically at adaptation services, there's a couple specific mechanisms that agroforestry can reduce these threats and enhance resiliency. One is alternating the microclimate to reduce the impact of extreme weather events. There is the whole reduction in drought or modifying, creating a more suitable microclimate, reducing moisture loss in a more forage-based systems. That shade factor and other contributing factors can help maintain the quality and quantity of forage production. We can also see how the microclimate can be altered to reduce livestock stress and enhance well-being, particularly with heat stress by providing shade, but also for those winter events that also do impact livestock by providing shelter from winter winds and cold rain events. And then we can also have greater habitat diversity to support organisms like pollinators and beneficial insects. That's greater structural and functional diversity that woody species can provide in agricultural systems can also enhance other ecosystem services. And then we create a more diversified production systems that help reduce risk under a fluctuating climate. If you have more enterprises through an agroforestry operation, it's a more resilient to the economic shocks that can come from whether climate change or even market changes. There's also from more of biodiversity, it can assist in plant species migration through planting decisions, as well as provide travel corridors for wildlife species migration. So again, just to really reiterate, risk management is difficult in simple monoculture systems. We can see here this example of a corn crop that's flooded and that will be impacted significantly. And here we have a agroforestry alley cropping system with a willow alley or willow rose and an alley crop in the middle. While the crop in the middle was lost this year or that year due to flooding, the willow crop survived and did well and offered an economic avenue for the producer. So again, that diversification helps create that resiliency. And those little spider charts on the side give you a sense of when we tend to go with simplified agricultural systems, they're often maximize crop production, but at a somewhat detriment to other services. And when we look at these diversified systems, there might be a reduction in the overall crop production, although not always the case because you're usually getting two crops off of the system. But you're also taking advantage of this diversification to get these other kind of ecosystem services up a little higher. And so to kind of just highlight a few research studies that kind of illustrate this, one showed the effects of agroforestry buffers on reducing soil loss around 30%. Nitrogen leaching was significantly reduced in alley cropping systems, around 82 to 91%, which not only helps protect groundwater from nitrates, but also helps recycle that nitrogen in a way that the woody plants are able to utilize it more. And so you create a more closed loop system. Some studies have shown that alley cropping in a wheat system has resulted in higher grain yields under drought, and that cattle can reach a higher body weight earlier with shade, protecting them against from heat heat events. So now kind of moving into more the mitigation side of the equation. When we look at agriculture greenhouse gas emissions, agriculture provides around 10 to 11% of the total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by sector. And so it's a significant player in this arena. And when we take a look at that at a finer, more detail, we can see it kind of breaks out into two broad categories. We have a lot that comes from soil management in terms of nitrous oxide emissions with fertilizer applications and so forth. And then also on the livestock side of the equation with methane production, as well as manure management. And that includes both nitrous oxides as well as methane. Interestingly, fuel combustion or fuel use is not that significant of a factor in the overall percentages from the agriculture sector. So when we look at the mitigation services of agroforestry, one is the sequestering of carbon. And carbon can be sequestered both in the woody biomass as well as in the soil. And it's important to note that that can be ephemeral or maybe not necessarily long-term if soil would get filled back up. You can lose soil carbon very easily, or if the woody biomass would be somehow burned or lost to decomposition, so the sequestering carbon is a great pathway, but it's important to know it can be not always permanent depending on management. And then there is the way that agroforestry can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It can reduce fossil fuel consumption. And even though that wasn't a significant part of the overall equation, any reduction in that really is beneficial because it's basically gone completely, as opposed to it's not ephemeral. If we reduce that consumption, then we can reduce nitrous oxide emissions through greater nutrient uptake through the plant diversity, as well as nitrogen fertilizer applications, particularly in the tree component, because you usually don't fertilize tree rows in agroforestry systems. And then there's research suggesting that the forage quality can actually help reduce enteric methane production. So when we look at carbon sequestration in agroforestry, tree biomass about 40 to 60 or 46 to 51% is carbon. Tree biomass or shrubby biomass can add a bit to the soil carbon profile with fine root production, as well as deeper root contributions, as well as greater litter fall. So those are all kind of mechanisms. And one study, this was actually out of Canada, looked at some poplar and spruce alley cropping systems compared to monoculture systems. And this was a really nice study that they looked at all the carbon pools. And they determined that the poplar system was about 41% greater carbon than monoculture, and the spruce system was about 11%. And the primary difference there is the poplar growing much faster, faster growing species. And just looking at some broad carbon sequestration rates, these aren't necessarily specific agroforestry, but looking at kind of afforestation on crop or pasture land, and we can see around 6.7 all the way up to about 19 metric tons of carbon per hectare per year, compared to some other kind of practices. And I want to just mention a tool called Comment Farm and Comment Planner. This is an online free tool. This allows individuals, farmers, producers, ranchers, to go in and based off of their production system or proposed ideas on their production system, see what are their greenhouse gas emission reductions based off of their practices. And so this is an example ran in Lancaster County, Nebraska, with an alley cropping system of 160 acres, and it generated some estimates of what the greenhouse gas emission reductions would be. And that tool can be found just by Googling Comment Planner. And so when we kind of scale up and try to look at the value of carbon or the impacts of carbon sequestration at a national level, it's very difficult due to a variety of factors, and everything from what lands do we consider suitable or in need of agroforestry, as well as the growth rates and the species selected. Just even regionally, there's a great variability in the United States in terms of tree growth rates. But here are two peer-reviewed estimates in the literature on what looking over across all agroforestry practices, what might be some annual sequestration across the U.S. And it's hard to sometimes understand what those numbers might relate to, but in terms of equivalency, this would be around 71 to 173 million cars per year off the road, or about 88 to 215 coal-fired power plants in 1 year. So it can be really quite significant if we are able to scale up to this level. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the effects of climate change on agroforestry. Being an ecological, biological-based system, obviously it is going to be susceptible to climate change as well. And a couple of the key areas that are going to be susceptible to climate change in terms of food production, whether you're going to have enough winter chilling requirements. We might have an increase in insect pest due to reduction in winter mortality of insect pests. Another concern is earlier bud burst, because we have some springs are warming up quicker, but there can still be late season frosts. And then there could be just reduced growth rates due to drought and floods, and increased mortality tied to that, as well as increased susceptibility to pests. So the key, I think, here is one of the challenges that will be finding plant material that can be fairly resilient to these factors, but it will be impacted as well. So moving into some case studies to kind of wrap it up. The first one I want to pick on is the Prairie States Forestry Project. And I'm not sure how many of you have heard of this, but it is the shelter belt program that was initiated in response to the Dirty 30s, when there was the Dust Bowl, and federal government, U.S. Forest Service, along with partners, initiated a tree planting or shelter belt planting program from 34 through 1942. And it planted over 18,000 miles of windbreaks or shelter belts through the Great Plains on over 30,000 farms. And this played a significant role in helping reduce the soil wind erosion in the area and provide other benefits to the farms that have adopted these. And there are still probably in the neighborhood, depending on some analysis, still about 40% of these are partially or fully intact. So these things have had multi-generational impact. I think there's a tendency to think of the Dust Bowl as a bygone era. However, we still have dust events and we still have significant wind erosion. Many of you might remember in 2018, there was a extreme dust event just west of Lincoln that resulted in a 29-car pileup and one fatality and many folks being sent to the hospital. And, you know, the wind still blows in the Midwest. In fact, we had one of our windiest years on record this year. And to compound that, from 2008 to 2012, a land area the size of New Hampshire was broken out of perennial grass cover into annual cropland. Again, these were highly erodible lands. Soils are very susceptible to wind erosion. So, you know, the need for controlling wind erosion through windbreaks and other mechanisms has not gone away. When we look at heat events, particularly in livestock growing regions, such as the Southeast, the future climate looks very scary. You know, we're looking at a large increase in the number of days over 95. And this is going to have a significant impact on livestock productivity and well-being. And one farmer in Missouri did this silvopasture project where he actually thinned out a tree stand, and part of the pasture paddocks had basically some trees in it to provide shade. And in 2010, which was a particularly hot and dry year in his area, he was able to still get weight gain in the silvopasture paddocks, where other producers in his area were losing or not gaining any weight per day with their livestock. And then if we look at cold water fisheries, there is an estimate of about over 60% decline in cold water fish habitat by 2100. And this includes trout, salmonoids, cold water fisheries. And you can see that pretty much in the east, there will no longer be any cold water fisheries, and in the west, it'll be greatly reduced. We know from research that riparian forest buffers can lower maximum summer water temperatures by around 3.3 degrees Celsius. And that might be enough to offset the impacts of warming. And one kind of example of this is the State of Washington Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. And in 1995, on the Tucson River, there was only 54 salmon returning, and there were no juvenile salmon present. And so they initiated a project that involved planting over 1,100 acres of riparian forest buffers, as well as other measures to try to reduce the water temperature, because that was considered the primary factor limiting the salmon fishery. And in the 20-year period, Chinook salmon rebounded from the 54 salmon to almost 1,800. And there was a decrease around 3.3 to 5.5 degrees Celsius. So a pretty exciting example there. And so wrapping it up, there's a bit of resources we have at the USDA National Agroforestry Center that you can find online at our website. We have a report on agroforestry and climate change that's available for download or as hard copies, as well as a bibliography on research that is focused on climate change and agroforestry. And I thank you for your attention. And by the way, there are some literature cited at the end of the presentation.